in the rest of the world, but it's great to be part of this event and great to be with all of you for the next hour or so. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about GSV Labs. I'm going to talk about the challenges that startups face around the world. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the ways in which we support them. And then, we can have a discussion on the existential threat that the coronavirus crisis now poses to startups around the world, and then certainly open up for question and answers. So as Virat said, I'm the CEO of GSV Labs. We are a Silicon Valley-based but global entrepreneurship and innovation services company. Our mission is empowering entrepreneurs and democratizing innovation around the world. And we do that by running innovation centers where startups can come and build their businesses. But we also do that through an online platform. Think of it as a virtual innovation center that provides all of our resources to startups around the world. Get the next slide. Thank you. Very quick overview of GSV Labs. We now support over 16,000 startups and entrepreneurs around the world in over 100 countries. We help our community in very many ways, including providing learning resources, networking community. We give them access to service providers. We give them access to investors as well. Our members have raised over $600 million in the last few years. We also work with corporate clients, over 25 corporate clients that we work with in terms of our innovation services. We have about 450 investors. We ourselves are an investor, but we work with about 450 investors who support our community as well. One of the things that we do for our community is to give them access to the best tools and resources that they need to build their businesses. We have over 120 service providers in our network that provide value of up to $800,000 to any single startup as well. And in the last year and a half or so, since we've been live on our global platform, our members have taken advantage of about $113 million in discounted services from our service providers. The next slide. So let me talk a little bit about the view from Silicon Valley, right? So Silicon Valley has for many, many years been the center of investment activity in early stage and venture in the world. We've been, the vast majority of investments that have gone into startups have really taken place in Silicon Valley over time. But we believe in the idea of a global Silicon Valley. And by that, we mean that the activity, the startup activity that has been concentrated in Silicon Valley for many years is now distributed around the world. In 2018, for the first time, there was more venture investment that took place outside the US than in the US for the first time. And so we see not Silicon Valley, but the development of a global Silicon Valley, innovation centers and innovation hubs, innovation cities around the world, which are replicating and challenging and advancing the kind of venture activity that's typically focused only within Silicon Valley over the past few years. And so what we're seeing now is the development of this global Silicon Valley, and that's a trend that we want to be able to support in the coming years. The second mega trend that we see, so on the one hand, you see the development of venture activity around the world. The second thing you see is the development of digital communities. I was chief business officer at Coursera, which is now the world's largest higher education platform, over 50 million learners registered on that platform. But on the other extreme, you have companies like Nextdoor that providing digital communities for neighborhoods. So whether you have traditional physical activity, we're seeing the continuation of the layering of digital activity on top of that physical activity, or extending that physical activity as well. And in some cases, whole new companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, which have created new ways of interacting that we didn't have prior to the development of a digital community. So keep the second trend in mind, as you say. Firstly, venture is taking place around the world. Startup activity is being more distributed. And then secondly, more and more digital. And in this current crisis, we've seen the explosion of these digital communities. We've seen, Zoom's usage has gone up 30% in the last 3 months. The same thing we're seeing with Microsoft Teams and other, with Slack, with WhatsApp. These are digital communication media that are now exploding because digital now has become the only way that we can communicate. And so along with this, we see the aspect innovation and entrepreneurship is global, and it's digital, and it's increasing year on year. And so the aspiration for people to become entrepreneurs is also increasing. Next slide, please. And not just in the US, I showed you what's happening in the US, but this is also happening around the world. 43% of people are motivated now to say that we want to start an entrepreneurial activity in the next 6 months. And this is not because they can't get jobs or because they don't have other economic opportunities, but because there is a desire now to be entrepreneurial and to be able to build a startup community and to build startup organizations as well. So that's the opportunity. So we know that the world is that venture investment is now global, that digital investment is significant, and that people have aspirations to start up, to be entrepreneurs and to launch startups. But it's still difficult to do so. And part of the reason is that the kind of resources and support mechanisms that startups need are still very, very fragmented. In a lot of countries, you don't have the opportunity to access the kind of startup-focused tools that we take for granted in Silicon Valley and in other innovation hubs. Often, entrepreneurship, and particularly startup, is one of the loneliest activities that you can engage in, and often you need the support of a community to be able to build your network. And it's not in many parts of the world, those communities are not available, or they're difficult to penetrate and become a part of. Similarly, finding if you go back just one slide, thanks. Finding advisors, finding mentors, finding people who might be able to, service providers, is not an easy task. You would have to spend a lot of time searching for these kinds of resources as well. And if you're not in a place that is already an innovation hub, these kinds of connectivity with these networks are not easy to build. Thank you. And then, so if that's not challenging enough, we now have a whole other set of challenges that are related to the current coronavirus crisis. I like to say that the coronavirus has really created an existential threat for startups in a way that is significant compared to the kind of challenges that startups face already. We know that 1 in 10 startups will go on to raise future funding. So we already know that the odds are stacked against startups. And then with the current crisis, we believe that 25 to 30% of startups that are around today will not survive the next 90 days. And that's how significant the crisis is for startups. Specifically, if you go back one more slide, thank you. Specifically, if you look at what are the impacts that the virus has had on startups, one, clearly it's financing, right? Investors are conserving cash, so there's no investment dollars available right now. Investors are also pushing portfolio companies to cut costs rather than to continue to put money in them. And the rapid technology changes that are taking place requires the changes in your business model in terms of how do you sell, how do you market, how do you raise awareness in the marketplace as well. There are management challenges as well. How do you retain key team members? How do you maintain a company culture and cohesion, social cohesion within the company when your whole company is distributed as well? How do you keep your key team members safe if in fact they have to travel to work for any reason? We're seeing challenges to the business model. Changing of sales strategy and operations will need to be done in this environment. How do we do pricing and customer retention? If, how much discounts do you have to give? If you're a consumer-facing business, consumers don't have a lot of discretionary funding right now. If you're a B2B business, we're beginning to see your customers begin to conserve their cash. How do you do pricing in this environment? And how do you retain your current customers? How do you set targets for your team? And what kinds of performance management do you do when there's so much uncertainty in terms of what the future will bring, not just in the short term, but also in the long term as well? And then finally, there's a whole personal dimension. As I said, entrepreneurship is sometimes a lonely activity. How do you keep yourself safe? How do you keep your family safe? How do you balance work and home if you are working from home all the time? And then how do you continue to maintain your social relationships? So there's a whole slew of challenges now that are over and above the existing challenges that we know startups face. What this calls for, this current environment calls for, is a new game plan. And I think that I like to give this analogy that we need to be managing in a bifocal way. I don't know if any of you know bifocals. I wear bifocals, so I'm very familiar with this. A bifocal lens allows you to see far, but also to see near at the same time. And that's the kind of strategy that we will need for startups. Startups need to manage for the near term in order to survive, right? So we've got to be focused entirely on the management of our cash and the management of our business and the retention of our customers right now, or we will go out of business. So there's a near-term focus that is based on survival. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about what our businesses will be like when we come out of this crisis. And so we have to keep that long-term distant vision as well in place in order to thrive after this crisis is over. So I think the combination and successful companies will find the right balance between the near term and the long term management of their companies. What is this components of this game plan? Of course, different companies will need to focus on different things, but there are, I think, some common elements that all companies will need to face. First and foremost, your number one priority today is cash. I mean, somebody asked me, what are the top 3 priorities for a startup in this environment? The number 1 priority is cash, the number 2 priority is cash, and the number 3 priority is cash as well. Everybody should be planning for significantly reduced revenue over the next 90 days. And then that means that we should be starting to focus on the conservation of cash, which is the focus on profitability over growth. The Silicon Valley mantra for successful startups has been growth at all costs. So, we will focus on growth rather than focus on profitability. I think for everyone around the world now, that in the short term, that has changed. Everybody now needs to focus on preservation of cash and profitability over growth. Companies should be revising their projections for their investors as well. And if you can go raise money, I would suggest very strongly go do that right now and don't worry about valuations. We've always been concerned about how much of my money am I giving up when I go and raise venture capital or other kinds of investments. I think valuation is not the most important part right now, but getting the funding is important. From the management point of view, I think all founders and CEOs or leaders of the company should be thinking about who are the people in the company they really, really need.
Nikhil?
Second, and I think that's the
yes, you're right
to say. And then finally, I think this is the time where we need to over-communicate with the team, over-communicate with your customers, give them the information that they need about the state of the business and your services. And this is a time, I think, where honesty is more important than optimism in order to continue to build a relationship of trust within your team and within your customers. Can we go to the next slide? So I've got 3 quotes, 3 words of wisdom that I would say that every startup should be thinking about right now. The first is from Paul Romer, the Stanford economist, who said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And what he's trying to say is the crisis gives us the opportunity to rethink our business, to rethink our business models, to rethink the way that we communicate and manage both internally and then how we interact with our customers. Business as usual is done now and for the foreseeable future. We should be thinking about how we're going to communicate and what changes do we need to make for our business. The second thing is from the boxer Mike Tyson, who said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. In other words, we need to make sure that the traditional planning in which we have a set of targets and we are running the company towards them, that has changed. We've all been punched in the mouth with the coronavirus, and now we need to be ready to be able to say whatever plans we have will change as we continue to encounter the external environment. And that's why the words of Charles Darwin are important, that those who survived are not the strongest or the most intelligent, but the most adaptable to change. And I think that applies to startups as well. Those that will survive are the ones that are most adaptable to change. Next slide, please. So very quickly, let me tell you the resources we provide to startups around the world. GSV Passport is our online platform, which is basically innovation as a services platform that provides startups actionable tools to be able to build their businesses, regardless of where they're located, and regardless of whether they've got access to innovation centers that they can go into and get those resources in a physical mode. So for us, Passport is digital first. What do we provide within Passport? We provide startups the opportunity to link with mentors, with investors, with our service providers, online events. They participate in a community and network of like-minded startups and entrepreneurs, and they get access to our learning resources. Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. We launched the platform at the beginning of 2019, and we've grown the platform to about 16,000 startups in the last 13 or 14 months. Startups from around the world are attracted to the services we provide. And I think that even recently, I got a text from a startup in New York that said, the GSV passport has been a godsend for us, because even in this environment where they can't get access to any physical resources, they continue to get access to all of our digital and online resources. Next, please. So if you look at us, our passport today, we get about 800,000 visitors. We have, as I said, 16,000 startups on the platform who've redeemed about $113 million in services. And then we also give passport to other organizations to manage their innovation centers. We expect that by the end of this year, we would have over 40,000 startups on our platform and over 30 organizations around the world using passport to manage their own entrepreneurial ecosystems. And so that's a quick update on GSV Labs. We connect Silicon Valley to the world and the world to Silicon Valley. We believe that entrepreneurial activity and startup activity is the engine of growth for the world. Entrepreneurship is the single largest sector in the world, and our mission is to support entrepreneurs and startups everywhere through on all devices and at any time.
Nikhil, thank you very much for this great presentation. We have many questions here and also on YouTube. So my first question, I was also shortlisting my questions before this online live stream. What should the startups be doing to survive in these hard days of outbreak?
Yes, as I said, if you think about that, my sort of game plan slide, the first thing to do is to survive, right? And in order to survive, the conservation of cash is going to be absolutely critical, at least for the next 90 days or so. So I would say every startup should be looking at what our revenue expectations were for this period and to reduce those significantly. So you say, okay, in my business model now, I'm going to take a 70%, 50%, 30% haircut on revenue. And then if I remodel my business, I need to figure out what I need to do to cut costs in order to survive in this new revenue environment. So the business model needs to be redone in order to determine how much cash you're going to need to survive through this period.
And do you think that Silicon Valley will be going to be persistent on the locational center? Because this outbreak gave us opportunity to realize that there is no need for a location or an office space or a physical geography. Do you think that in our next year's time, Silicon Valley be global or talent will be anywhere?
Yeah, I think Silicon Valley is already global. Frankly, we see, there are more. I think last year there were more unicorns outside the US than there were in Silicon Valley. So we know that both in terms of the number of companies started, the amount of money invested, and the success that these companies are realizing, we know that that's taking place at a global level right now, and it's no longer limited to Silicon Valley. So I believe that aspiration and talent to launch successful companies is evenly distributed around the world. What has been different is that the resources that those entrepreneurs needed, the opportunity to build these companies, that has been unevenly distributed. But I think that what we are seeing now, and particularly accelerated through the emergence of digital forms of communication and building and digital business models, that we will see that entrepreneurial activity now much more evenly distributed around the world.
You have deep experiences, especially with the startups all over the world. What are the common mistakes that entrepreneurs makes in the early stages of their startups?
I think the most common mistake is taking on too many opportunities at the same time. I think we find that in early stage companies, as people begin to build products, there are lots of use cases for those products. And startups tend to be desperate to start building their businesses and being able to generate revenue. And so they start focusing on multiple use cases at the same time. So I think the most important advice that I would give an early stage company is to focus on building your business in a single use case. And when you've been able to do that successfully and have built a successful business around that, then start looking at other use cases. So I think that focus on single product, single market, and being able to successfully find product market fit before you diversify your business, I think that's one of the critical components to this early stage success.
You have 2 office spaces in US. So what do you think are you going to do when the outbreak completes?
We chatted about this earlier, Barak. I said, when I figured it out, I'm sure to share that with you. I think it's going to be very challenging for us. We have 2 innovation centers, one in Silicon Valley and one in Boston, Massachusetts. There are about 130 to 140 companies, startups that are located in those centers. So 2 things. One, firstly, because of Passport and because we have an online platform, we've been able to support those members even while those physical centers have been closed, and they've been closed for about 4 weeks now in both Boston and in Silicon Valley. So the digital platform has allowed us to continue to support the community and give them the resources that they need to continue to build and grow their businesses. We expect that within the next 4 to 8 weeks, we will probably reopen those centers. The conditions under which they reopen, though, are very uncertain right now. We know that the government, both the state government in California and in Massachusetts, as well as the US government, will probably provide us some guidelines. Those guidelines may be related to social distancing, to the number of people that can be gathered in an event. We may also be required to test our members as well. So how we change and adapt our operations to fit the what may emerge from here as the new normal is something that we are working on very actively right now. We have a team, the managers of our innovation centers are hard at work right now, trying to come up with a game plan of how do we manage physical spaces at a time when we may still require, the virus is still going to be with us, we know that. So how do we manage those physical spaces in a way that minimizes the threat of the virus to our community while still being able to give them access to the resources that they need and are located within those physical locations? That's the challenge that we're working on right now.
I mean, very clear answer. And do you think that which sectors will be affected with these hard situations? I mean, some of the sectors are affected positively as a kind of growth, and some of the sectors has been affected by negative. So which startups and verticals do you think that will be next months will be more on the rise?
So clearly, we can see the growth and development on digital platforms and digital communities. And the first rush of that growth has been in digital communication platforms. Just as the world has become remote and distributed, companies and individuals have turned to digital platforms as ways of continue to communicate and run their businesses. So all of the digital platforms that we see that are communication platforms clearly are significantly on the rise. But as this crisis continues as we settle into this new mode of working, I think we'll begin to see
Nikhil, do you hear us? I think we lost Nikhil, and he will be back in a couple of seconds. If you have any questions, please write on the chat box. We are reading all the questions, and we will be very happy to ask Nikhil. And if you need more information about GSV Labs, you can also visit. No problem, Nikhil. Yes, you were talking about the sectors and verticals, which kinds of. So we have lost you a couple of 1 minute.
Sure. So the point that I was making is that I think we'll see not so much vertical focus, but really a horizontal focus. And those companies that have been able to build digital and virtual ways of managing their business, selling their products, are going to be successful. Those that don't make the transition from physical first to digital first will suffer during this period.
And also, you have deep experience about the education sector as an academician, and also your experience in Coursera. Education has, very quickly changed, especially in Turkey. I don't know the exact situation in US or other countries, but online education will be, I think, not future, but probably tomorrow. What do you think about it?
Well, there are right now 1.2 billion people who are on online education platforms. We've never had that kind of scale before. And I think that what we've been seeing in the last 5 years or so, we're beginning to see the fruition of that, which is the development of pedagogy, of teaching learning environments where knowledge can be imparted and absorbed digitally online in ways that we had not seen before. So what we're seeing now is both the maturation of the online pedagogy on the one hand, and then also the need of people to be able to access learning virtually. And those two are coming together, I think, to create a very powerful momentum for online education that we haven't had before. In some parts of the world, people used to sort of think that online education is inferior to face-to-face and physical environments, and it isn't one or the other, but really we'll see going forward both of them coexisting in the same educational environment. Some resources will be available physically, some resources will be available digitally, but I think that online education now has become an integral part of the education environment.
And what about the startup education? I mean, universities take a great role, but also accelerators, incubators, and such as GSV Labs business model. How does the startup education will be shifting through?
Well, and I think we're going to see a lot of that go online as well. At GSV, you think of GSV Labs. Passport is basically a virtual innovation center. and all the resources that you get in our physical environment, you can get online. And we've also taken our accelerators and moved them online as well. So I think the availability of the resources that startups need is going to become more widespread digitally than has been in the past, where you actually had to go to a physical center to access those resources. So the training and the development of startups itself, I think, is going to become very democratized because of the availability of online resources.
And also, there are many questions on the chat box, so let me ask you some of them as well. Do you have any partners in Pakistan as a GSV Labs?
We don't have any formal partners from Pakistan, but we have lots of startups from Pakistan that are on our online platform.
How do you think augmented reality-based digital communication platforms operating in COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. We had already begun to see the incorporation of AR within different environments, and I think we're going to see that accelerated as well in these coming years. One of the challenges of virtual environments is the inability to provide sort of what will be considered sort of hands-on learning. And I think that the use of augmented reality and even virtual reality to be able to overcome those challenges, I think we're going to see a quick and rapid adoption of these kinds of solutions, particularly within education environments.
Which parts of the Silicon Valley ecosystem cannot be replicated in other places other than financing?
We believe that everything can be replicated. That's why we believe in the global Silicon Valley and not just limited to what can happen here. I do think that there are Silicon Valley itself was a combination of different sectors that are sometimes difficult to bring together in the same ecosystem. If you look at the success of the Valley, it was a combination of the availability of financing, of the availability of having high-class education institutions, and also the ability to have large corporations that could serve as both customers as well as investors in some of these startups. So it was the combination of having both a corporate environment, an education environment, and a financing environment, all existing in a closed geographical space that made Silicon Valley as successful as it's come to be. But increasingly, we can begin to put together these resources in different geographical environments. We're seeing some of these initiatives in Europe and in Asia as well, where we're trying to bring together the combination of education and companies and financing in geographical environments. We also believe that we'll create these resources online as well. And so if you come to Passport as a Passport member, you get access to a knowledge base and learning resources. You get access to investors, and you get access to enterprises that might be interested in the products that startups produce. So we're trying to replicate that online as well.
So how GSV Labs evaluate the exit strategies where the developing country doesn't offer profitable IPOs or M&As?
Yeah, so first, I think, on the M&A side, I think we're seeing a lot of activity that is more uniform across different geographies. Exits through IPOs remain uneven in many jurisdictions. Our view as an investor, in terms of thinking about exit strategies for companies that are not based in the US, is to have them have a US incorporation right now that will give them the opportunity in the future to have an exit that through a US company as well. But again, this is a matter of time, not anything that is structurally, that's a structural barrier. I think as markets mature and as startup activity begins to become a greater portion of economic activity, we'll begin to see some of these barriers around IPO and M&A activity begin to come down.
The travel and the tourism industry is in trouble situation. So what is your thoughts about the investors' mind in investing in travel startups?
Yeah, I think businesses that are based on the physical movement of people, I think are going to be underinvested in for some period of time. I think we're going to see considerable shakeup both in travel and tourism at the global level in terms of the large service providers, whether they're hotel chains or whether they are airlines. And I think that startups that are focused around providing those kinds of services will remain underinvested. I do think, though, that startups that are focused on providing digital tools to companies in the travel and tourism industry in order for them to become more efficient, those kinds of companies will continue to attract investment.
Internet usage worldwide average is less than 5%, 7 billion, vary according to countries. This is Yuan Zarko's question, by the way. So GSV statement that 1.2 billion people are using online education seems to be a little bit far. So learning is limited by access to affordable internet. Yuan is asking a question and commenting, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It is limited to affordable internet, but it is also, I think we forget when we think about online education, we think entirely about sort of the online education providers like Coursera and edX and others. But the fact is that online resources are now being used within campus settings. So I think one of the reasons why we're seeing, for instance, every resident, at least we're seeing in the US and in Europe and even in China, where we're seeing that institutions that were residential campuses have continued to serve their students by taking their courses online. And by online, it doesn't necessarily mean an online course like a Coursera course, but simply having classes on Zoom. And you're seeing that around the world. So what we're seeing right now is the growth of people who are being educated through a digital medium.
We have many questions, but this should be one of the last few questions. GSV is interested in accelerating startups in Latin America.
We're interested in accelerating startups everywhere in the world, certainly Latin America as well. We already have a significant number of startups from Mexico and Chile on our platform, but there are other countries represented. Those are the two, and Brazil as well. Yes, we're very much interested in supporting Latin American startups, and we're doing so on our platform already.
Nikhil, thank you very much for today's valuable insights and your presentation. It was very effective and I think valuable to all startups and all our audience, I think. And we wish you a safe and healthy day today. And thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation. Please feel free to share the presentation with people who are on the webinar. And good luck to everyone, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. Have a great day in San Francisco.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.